Good afternoon. Welcome to today's Wisconsin Health News virtual briefing on what National Institute of Health changes could mean for Wisconsin. My name is Tim Stum, editor of Wisconsin Health News. Thanks to all of you for tuning in today. We have a really great panel with us today to talk about this important topic. I am thrilled to introduce Johannes Britz, Senior Vice President for Academic Affairs at the Universities of Wisconsin, Karyn Frick, Psychology Professor at UW-Milwaukee, Dr. John Raymond, CEO and President of the Medical College of Wisconsin, Tom Still, President of the Wisconsin Technology Council, and Sean Kirkby, Senior Editor of Wisconsin Health News, who will be moderating today's event. Before we get started, I want to make sure we thank our very generous sponsors of the Wisconsin Health News virtual series. Healthcare leaders from across the state sign up to watch these virtual events, and they would not be possible without the generous support of these organizations. So a huge thank you to Aurora Healthcare, AARP Wisconsin, Anthem Blue Cross and Blue Shield of Wisconsin, Delta Dental of Wisconsin, Amplify Health, and Quartz. Wisconsin Health News is an online nonpartisan news service. In addition to hosting events like these, we also publish a daily email newsletter. If you're not yet a subscriber, I encourage you to sign up for a free trial, which you can do on our website at wisconsinhealthnews.com. And I want to give an extra thanks today to Amplify Health, today's featured sponsor. We are really grateful for all of their very generous and continued support. Here to say a few words is Heather Shimmers, President of Amplify Health by Gunderson.
Thank you, Tim, and hello, everybody. As Tim mentioned, my name is Heather Shimmers, and I am honored to serve as the Gunderson Region President for Amplify Health, and it's really nice to be with all of you today. So in a few minutes, you are going to hear from some exceptional speakers about the critical importance of medical research. Amplify Health is one of the many systems nationally that pairs with best-in-class care and treatment with medical research and intentional investment to support services patients need right away. I'd like you to know about one of those critical needs, behavioral health care, and what Amplify Health has done to intentionally invest at a time when others are moving away from it. We recently expanded our inpatient behavioral health beds at our Gunderson La Crosse Hospital. This expansion represented an almost 20% increase in bed availability, which will allow us to serve an additional 200 adult patients annually who are experiencing acute mental health crises. It also means that we can provide care roughly to 1,600 patients each year. That's a 50% increase in capacity for those with our highest acuity levels. Now, I'm sure many of you are aware of some hospital closures in Western Wisconsin that have significantly reduced the availability of inpatient behavioral health services in our region. By increasing bed capacity, Amplify Health is meeting a critical community need, and we're reducing the burden on families who previously had to travel long distances for care. But wait, we have a little bit more. We recently announced the creation of our empath unit within our La Crosse Behavioral Health Department on our La Crosse campus. empath stands for Emergency Psychiatric Assessment, Treatment, and Healing. It's an alternative way to treat patients who come to an emergency room while having a mental health crisis. Amplify Health's empath unit will be the first of its kind in Wisconsin, and we plan to open that very early in 2026. We are essentially creating an intensive behavioral health center to more efficiently serve our patients. Those experiencing mental health emergencies will continue to receive care in an emergency department, but rather than wait in line for other patients, these patients will be assessed in a quiet, calm environment and then be transferred to the hospital's new empath facility. Most people will get the care they need within 12 to 16 hours and then be able to move on to the appropriate level of care for each individual person. It could be outpatient care, partial hospitalization, or inpatient care. We're listening to the concerns of our patients in our community and making intentional investments to ensure that everyone has access to the care they need. Our goal is to continue to create a healthier, more resilient community where behavioral health is a priority and where no one has to face their struggles alone. I'm so incredibly proud to be part of a healthcare system that prioritizes the well-being of our community, even when it means taking on additional challenges. I want to offer a huge thank you to Tim and Wisconsin Health News for bringing everyone together today and for today's discussion on another worthy challenge that we must face together. From everyone at Amplify Health, thank you so much for attending today and for working together for a healthier future. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Heather. And thanks again to Amplify Health for all the generous and continued support. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to Sean to lead today's discussion.
Thanks, Tim. The National Institutes of Health, the world's largest public funder of biomedical research, has been in upheaval in recent months. Delayed meetings, canceled grants, staffing reductions, and sudden policy shifts have roiled universities and industry. This week, Dr. Jay Bhattacharya, the new head of NIH, said he's working to restore normal order, but has defended several of these changes as the agency focuses on using limited resources to fight chronic disease. Our panel is going to take a deep dive into what's happened and what these changes mean for the state and the future of medical research. To start our discussion, I want to talk about the breadth and impact of NIH funding in the state. Johannes, can you give us a sense of the scope of NIH funds at the universities of Wisconsin? How much are your institutions receiving, and how many staff are being supported through these grants?
Yeah, thank you, Sean, and thank you also for the opportunity, to participate in such an important panel and topic, that addresses the very well-being of us as human beings. I looked at our two R1 institutions, UW-Madison and UW-Milwaukee. Milwaukee is smaller, of course, in terms of its research enterprise, but it's about $8 million in grants from NIH at UW-Milwaukee. A number of grants and contracts being supported for research. But really, when you look at UW-Madison, it's massive. I had a discussion just late last week with their vice chancellor for research, and she indicated, that it's about half of their grant funded and contracts is actually NIH related federal funding. And that's about now, it was a few years ago, 470 million. Now it's 525 million. It's massive, right? So you can just see the impact that it does have on the research enterprise at Madison. And then, the number of people that is being supported on NIH funding at this point, it's about 2,700 clinical trials. And then 20,000 people in the state of Wisconsin benefit from NIH funding related research by UW-Madison. So I would just say it's a massive enterprise in terms of health in the state, specifically at Madison.
Thanks. Dr. Raymond, could you talk a little bit about NIH funding at MCW? What's the significance of these dollars at your institution?
Oh, yeah. Thank you, Sean. Well, we've been, obviously it varies from year to year, but it's somewhere between 110 and $130 million. And we are a freestanding health sciences university. We rank number 79 in the country in terms of total research expenditures. So our research enterprise expends a little over $400 million a year. Obviously, the NIH is the premier funding source in many ways. The peer review process that the NIH uses is the envy of the world. It's one of the things that makes America great, is our National Institutes of Health. So we work on every disease that you can imagine, especially those relevant to large numbers of Wisconsin residents: Alzheimer's disease and other neurodegenerative diseases, traumatic brain injury, spinal cord injury, cancer, cardiovascular, infectious diseases, diseases of every organ system that you can imagine. And so the recent changes really have fundamentally altered the way that we think about our relationship with the National Institutes of Health. There's a real prospect that we and others will not only need to redirect research, but also shrink our research enterprise based on some of the ideas that are being circulated about how to better manage NIH funding. Johannes mentioned the impact. We have literally thousands of people here at MCW that are engaged in our research enterprise, including learners. And I did want to say that for every dollar of NIH funding that comes into the state, there's an economic impact of 8-fold in the community. And so, for example, MCW's NIH research portfolio generates about 3,000 jobs off our campus with other vendors and other partners in the community.
Thanks, Dr. Raymond. Tom, can you talk a little bit about the impact this has across the state? How does this kind of impact, how does NIH funding in Wisconsin impact private industry?
Sure. Well, and Dr. Raymond just touched on that, of course, with his, just with MCW alone, with their economic impact. All of us probably on this call and listening in, they care about things like the national debt and what has to be done to bring it down. But I don't think this is the place to start with NIH. And because of the kind of economic impact and the health impact, the kinds of things that have happened over time in terms of cures, diagnosis, imaging, all of that, and with a lot of it centered in Wisconsin, have been really significant and affect human health. So that's one piece to remember. But when you look at NIH as a percentage of the federal budget, it's about 60. I was looking at 2023 figures, which is the latest I could find. There was about 60 billion in NIH funding out of a total budget of 6.2 trillion. So we're talking less than 1% of the federal budget. And yet it has that kind of economic impact across the state. So in addition to Madison, Milwaukee, MCW, you see it in the other universities of Wisconsin system schools, and you see it in places like the Marshfield Clinic, which does a significant amount of research. So it is spread out, it is dispersed, and it's significant. And if you look at what it was, again, this is 2023, and I know it's gone up, but if you look at that year alone, it was about, approaching 700 million in Wisconsin. You divide that out by the number of people in the state, 6 million people, it's about $110 per capita. To me, that's a really good investment in the health of this population, but also the population around the country and indeed around the world.
Thanks, Tom. Professor Frick, could you talk about the research that NIH has funded for you? How does the NIH support your work?
Absolutely. Yeah, happy to. So I study basically how memories are formed. We really want to try to understand the neurobiology sort of on a cellular and molecular level, how memories are formed, because memory loss is characteristic of aging, of neurodegenerative diseases such as Alzheimer's, characteristic of psychiatric diseases. And so if we can, effective treatments for those disorders are really only going to come if we understand the underlying biology that helps to create memory. So my particular niche within that is to try to understand how a class of hormones called sex steroid hormones regulate memory function. Particularly, we're interested in estrogens. This is important for memory, particularly for women, but for men as well, because it turns out that these are important neuromodulators throughout the brain, help with memory, help with motor function, help with many different things, and contributes, we think, to the causes of Alzheimer's in women. Women are significantly more likely to develop Alzheimer's disease than men, and we think that menopause contributes to that, the loss of estrogens at menopause. So with that background, then the NIH has funded my research for the last 25 years funded this basic research where we're trying to understand those cellular mechanisms. But the NIH, I'm not only a professor, but I'm also the chief scientific officer of a company that's trying to develop new drugs to treat symptoms of menopause, memory loss, and hot flashes. And so we've received small business funding from the NIH as well that's helped my company start to commercialize those discoveries that came from the basic research started here at the university. So there are multiple ways in which NIH funding has really been integral to try to develop sort of next generation treatments for memory loss.
Thank you, Professor. Just to kind of stick with you for a few minutes, there's been a number of changes at NIH since January. Can you talk about how these changes have kind of impacted your work? What have you noticed since the Trump administration came into office?
Right. Personally, so far, I haven't lost either of the NIH grants that I currently have, but it's thrown us into a great deal of uncertainty as to whether those grants will continue, which makes it very difficult to plan in terms of hiring new graduate students, hiring personnel, knowing what studies we can do in the near future. I do have colleagues who have had grants terminated here. as you were alluding to earlier, grant review panels were canceled in the spring. So there's lots of uncertainty about submitting new grants, whether existing grants will continue. So it's really thrown the whole enterprise into chaos, really.
Got it. Thank you, Professor. Dr. Raymond, can you talk a little bit about what have these changes meant at the Medical College of Wisconsin? Have you had grants canceled? Have you had to take any actions to potentially lay off staff because of these changes?
Right now, the impact in terms of grant terminations has been relatively minor, but it's not minor to the people that are impacted by this. We've had grants that were funded and then rescinded. We've had grants that receive fundable scores that are in limbo, and we've had a total of 8 cancellations. 2 of those were subcontracts, where the primary was at another university. The total impact is about $5 million. And I think the larger impact is the delay in funding. So we're tracking the NIH funding is running at about 50% of the usual cadence, both in terms of new awards being granted and continuing grants which have already been approved for multiple years, not getting their notice of award for the subsequent years. What that really does for us, not only do we have to find other jobs for people that were just hired and then had their grant rescinded, but we're trying to find ways to bridge faculty who've hired up. They had every expectation that their grants would continue for the period of time that they were funded for, and for which the awards are not here yet. We are tightening our belt at MCW across all of our missions. We've had a soft hiring freeze for non-clinical faculty and staff that was implemented ever since the first executive order came about the indirect cost cap. And we started seeing that there was the threat for grants being terminated based on, I guess, when we've received some letters that are fairly brutal to receive that basically say that the work is no longer relevant or isn't a priority area for the NIH or no longer is thought to impact the majority of Americans. So a lot of issues, financial planning issues, people feeling like their jobs are uncertain.
A follow-up, Dr. Raymond, for the grants that have been canceled and delayed, is there any trend that you're noticing among the research that they're focused on? Can you give examples of what types of grants have been canceled?
Yeah, there's no secret, and most of these are publicly available, but it would be for transgender issues, such as looking at the hormonal changes that happen when people are given gender transition therapies or puberty blockers, grants that have to do with behavioral aspects of medication compliance in men who have sex with men, for example, and others along the same lines. So these are actually getting to areas that many people would say are political, where the science is actually being canceled based on ideology and not on high quality peer review. And again, I'm going to get back to the peer review system that the National Institutes of Health has is objective. It brings in experts, and it is the envy of the world, and that is being challenged right now.
Thanks, Dr. Raymond. Johannes, can you talk a little bit about the impacts at the universities of Wisconsin? Are similar things happening there?
Yeah, I would actually concur with my 2 colleagues, Karyn and Dr. John, that, it reminded me, and during the COVID time when we kind of, wow, how do we act? How do we get together? How do we plan? How do we think through this? Things happen so fast. So in a way, it's just how do you organize and how do you plan when you didn't see everything coming your way? So I think in a one way, it is that uncertainty and there's no playbook and how do you move forward? That's one thing. The other thing I know with UW-Madison, as with MCW, some of the programs has been terminated. I know there are 4 programs that I know of that got being terminated. Now, when you do terminate the program and there's no more funding for it, the inevitable is that you have to do layoffs, right? That's one thing. Where do you find bridge funding, right? If the indirects do get cut and you need to continue some of the research, the trials that you're busy with, where do you find bridge funding? But bridge funding is short term, right? And so you need to think long term, where do you get the funds if you run out of your bridge funds? I think the other thing, in my discussions also with UW-Madison and Milwaukee is, how many doctoral students do you actually bring into your campus based on the programs? Because in the past, when you have your grant funding, it can carry so many doctoral students. So what I understand also specifically at Madison is they have reduced the number of doctoral students in these specific areas of NIH funding programs. So that does have an impact. And then I think just budget planning, as Dr. Raymond said, how do you plan your budget? Do you do an overall reduction? How do you plan on it? Because until the budget is kind of finalized. So I know all our universities go through the process of reevaluating where you are in your bigger budget picture. And then, of course, I'm not a lawyer, so I don't always understand all the vocabulary that people are using, but I do know the avenue that people are taking is kind of legal appeals, administrative appeals, declarations, open letters that has been sent to challenge the termination and to challenge the indirects that has been reduced from 55 to 15%. So there's a legal avenue also but it takes time, right? And hard effort and work all over the country. And I think the other thing is just work with your congregational delegation in DC and make sure that the message that we bring across, the message that it impacts not just the economic activities in the state, but the real life of people, the health of people in the state, the well-being, that they can bring across that message in DC where it does matter, right? And then I know there's also an engagement with alumni and with a private sector to bring across the message as well. We in the universities of Wisconsin also meet, I think, like daily, literally, with a communication group on federal updates to really make sure there's effective communication with all our campuses. So like every morning, 8 o'clock, they get together, and sometimes even in the afternoon again, to make sure there's consistency and everybody gets the same message, even though we are in a time of uncertainty. And then, of course, like today, use social media to bring across the important message. So that's in kind of in a nutshell what we do here at the universities of Wisconsin.
So Johannes, I wanted to stick with you for this next question. This week, NIH released a notice saying it will no longer fund research at institutions with DEI programs that violate federal anti-discrimination laws or that have any boycott of Israeli companies or companies doing business in Israel. Have you all had discussions about how this policy is going to impact you all, and what kind of steps are you taking to meet this policy?
It's so recent, right? So when I saw that, I didn't have time really to engage with Professor Dr. President Rothman really on how do we approach this. I think we will have a discussion with our key stakeholders and say, how do we approach this? Because what is meant by DEI? How do we understand it? How do we, is it really focused? I think it's still that's just the clarity of what is meant by these decisions. We need to get that clarity before actually I think we can make further decisions on the matter.
Thank you. Dr. Raymond, what was your kind of reaction to this announcement that came out Monday? Have you all had time to process it and figure out how you're going to comply?
Well, we're already complying. Let me just be clear. We will comply with the law. On the other hand, as a health science university who really exists to serve everyone, especially the people who need us the most, whether they're people of color in Central City, Milwaukee, or farmers in the Northwoods, we're here to serve people that have a disproportionate burden of health disparities and poor outcomes from common diseases. That's what we're all about. In order to do that, there's evidence that suggests if you have a diverse workforce, your outcomes are better. So there's scientific evidence to suggest that diversity does matter in delivering healthcare. What I'm troubled by most is the encroachment of this, I guess, expression of concern about DEI into what I would call health equity. So, for example, trying to address the underlying causes of higher rates of prostate cancer in African-American men and worse outcomes, or difficulties with access to obstetrical care in the Northwoods. All of those are at risk. And there is a danger that people don't understand the difference between illegal DEI, which is to give someone an advantage based on race or background, versus what is in the normal course of trying to deliver healthcare to a diverse population of 6 million people in Wisconsin. And that is a huge challenge. And I do fear that some of the grant terminations have spilled into the health equity space, which would be a shame. We have a moral imperative to address health disparities where they are, no matter who's experiencing them. And I would also say it's financially smart to make sure that we have a healthy workforce, and the people that are having bad outcomes are the ones we should focus on.
Thanks, Dr. Raymond. Tom, could you talk a little bit about how the Tech Council and your members are kind of reacting to these changes that have come out since January? Are your members concerned? How is it affecting them?
They're very concerned, and I'd even go a step farther and say worried. Just yesterday at a luncheon that we held through the Tech Council, our guest was Dr. Johannes, who directs the Wisconsin Institutes for Discovery on the Madison campus. She's also chairwoman of the Coalition for Life Sciences, which is nationwide. And that group has put out a letter to the administration, to members of Congress and others expressing those concerns. But on this DEI question, for example, she suggested that there's been an overly broad net thrown over this. For example, just searching for diversity in some of the grant proposals, it could be diversity of microbes, it could be diversity of cells, it could be that kind of diversity. And so that has been singled out in some cases in some of the grants that have come under fire. So that's an interesting piece on this. When you look at Wisconsin's tradition of health and innovation, it goes back decades, if not centuries plus. And a lot of that innovation has been translated into economic growth. When you consider venture and angel capital investments in the state and the kinds of companies that have arisen because of that, I think a lot of our members see this very directly as an economic impact that could have dire effects over time. It's more long-term, of course, but it's out there. And so I think for our members, which range in size from, an Epic to a mom and pop company, a lot of them see these economic effects coming down. And one other thing to consider right now is the BioHealth Tech Hub in Wisconsin, which has been approved. But, how's that going to move ahead in this environment? So there's a lot to be concerned about.
Tom, maybe just to follow up a little bit on that last point. I mean, how do you think this is going to impact that biotech hub? I mean, I believe a lot of that funding came from a different federal agency than NIH. But are there impacts on those efforts now because of these changes?
I think there can be, and we need to be wary about it. You're right. I mean, it's coming from different sources in some cases, but you can even see where the National Science Foundation is under pressure in some ways. You can see things like the NIH, which is a long acronym, but it's about rural health and agricultural health, is going to be under pressure. So I think it's pretty extensive. Now, maybe I'm an incurable optimist, but there are some things that seem like it may be a pathway to restoration in some cases. For example, one of our board members, Spencer Smith, did some research just yesterday after Joe Handelsman's talk about long COVID and some of the restoration of grants around that after the evidence was presented that it was having an effect. And there was, in fact, a waste of money if you let those research projects and clinical trials just lie fallow. So I think there's a way to make the case that it's almost perpetuating more government waste if you don't follow up with things that are already in the pipeline with clinical trials, research, and everything, and the notion of being able to push that out into products and jobs and service.
Thanks, Tom. I wanted to take a deep dive into a policy that has been mentioned by a lot of folks that caused some tremors back in February when it was unveiled. NIH moved to cap reimbursement for administrative and facility costs for research, known as indirect cost, for grant recipients at about 15%. That amounted to a large cut, as Johannes has mentioned, to some institutions in Wisconsin, like UW-Madison, where the rate was 55.5%. That change would have cost about $65 million from the campus, according to court filings. That policy is blocked from taking effect right now due to court action. But I want to take a little bit of a deep dive into it and its ramifications. And, Professor Frick, could you talk about what exactly are indirect costs here? I mean, how are they kind of important to research?
Right, happy to. So when we receive a grant from the NIH, there are two piles of costs. There's direct costs, which are pay for personnel. They pay for research supplies and the things that we do to actually do the research. The indirect costs help to support that enterprise. So pay for the utilities, pay for the floor cleaning, pay for administrative help in the department to help us, say, order things, help us arrange travel for conferences and so on. But there's also a large regulatory apparatus here at the university that we depend on. There's folks in the Office of Research that help us with grants management, make sure we're abiding by the NIH policies. They help us submit grants, they help us manage grants once they're here. There's also staff for institutional animal care and safety. There's folks here for laboratory safety, for biosafety, that make sure that we are, again, complying with NIH and USDA regulations, if you're talking about animal research, but also help to make sure that people are properly trained so that they're safe in the lab and don't hurt themselves through the work that they're doing. So, if you think about faculty, PIs as business owners, our job is to bring in revenue, so secure contracts from clients, and the service we're providing is research. In order to do that research, if you're thinking about a business in the community, not only are they paying the salaries of employees and they're paying for their materials, but they're also paying for their heat, their light, the people to clean the floors and so on, all of those things that go into a successful business. Well, that's really what the indirect costs are. They're integral to the research, but they're not costs going directly to the lab. They're going to support the lab.
Thanks, Professor. Johannes, what was kind of the impact when this notice dropped back in February? What steps did you all have to kind of take to address it?
Yeah, I think, and Sean, just also to Frick's point, this is a rate that's negotiated. It's not just that the universities say this is the rate that we want. It is negotiated between the university and the feds, and then actually, sometimes the university might come up a little bit higher, and it's renegotiated to a lower rate. And health-related and medical research, that's expensive. So you would expect that the labs, the infrastructure that you have to develop, that 55% is really what is needed to support the research enterprise. So I thought I would just put that out there as well. Some other research that you do when it's just surveys and it's not that expensive on your indirect cost, then it's lower. But on average, that I thought that's just good for context to understand when you talk about NIH funding and you talk about indirect cost, you talk about expensive research that cannot really be done if you do not have that indirect cost to support it. So that is for me just a very important variable when you look at the implications. Now that it is on hold, when I did talk again, last week to the UW-Madison Vice Chancellor, the question is, how do we support this in this time, in the interim time, until they hear whether this is going to go back or what is going to happen? The research needs to go on. So I think that was one of the first steps that they took, is to say, where can we find bridge funding to support that loss of the 65 million? And what I also didn't realize is, on top of this 55%, UW-Madison also put in additional funding, their own funding, to really support this research. That is not even enough. So it does have a major impact, the holistic picture of what is happening. And I think, if we really go down to 15%, it will have a big impact on the specifically the health-related research that we're doing. So I think it's now wait and see. And then the question would be, and I'm not sure where the answer will come from. If it is stuck at 15%, where does that additional funding come from to continue with the research that's being done? Right? It cannot just be bridge funding indefinite or funding from the university. Where do you get that? Do you increase your so-called direct funds to offset your indirect? That is kind of, the question I think that is on people's minds at this point.
Just for
Sean, I want to make
go
sure
ahead.
a couple of points that Drs. Frick and Britz made are amplified here. First of all, these are real costs. I mean, it is expensive to support research. And also 55% is not 55% of the total award. It is an add-on that's based on 100% of the grant that goes to the faculty member. So you're really talking about a third of the total cost. And as Johannes said, these rates are negotiated. This process has been refined over 5 decades to build a partnership between universities and the NIH that has produced remarkable work, the envy of the world. And the indirect costs do not cover the full cost of having a research enterprise. It's about half. The institution has to come up with the rest of the money. As Dr. Frick said, it isn't just the people that manage the labs. It's payroll, it's accounting, it's everybody that's involved in managing a research program. Those are real costs. So what MCW has done, we, again, I said, have a soft hiring freeze. We're still hiring clinical faculty, but we put a pretty hard pause on everyone else. We capped our graduate students. It was very painful. We had to do it on very short notice because we're trying to make a commitment to the people that are here now. That is challenging. We made a decision to close our PA program, which we had invested in, and we're going to open in 2027. So we're tightening our belt across the board to prepare for this. And what I think everybody needs to understand, if the indirect cost rate precipitously goes down without any discussion to 15%, we will all need to shrink our research enterprise. There is no way to accommodate that with elasticity from our other missions and our finances or with philanthropy. It's simply not possible.
So Dr. Raymond, just to kind of follow up on that last point, when this was announced, NIH said that universities have large endowments they can use for these costs. Indirect cost caps are lower at private foundations, and that they wanted to direct as much money as possible towards, quote, direct scientific research costs rather than administrative overhead, end quote. What's your kind of response to those arguments for this policy of capping these costs at about 15%?
Well, I'm going to be charitable and assume that people actually don't know how endowments work. Endowments are created when people are inspired to give to your institution to support a research program, a scholarship for a student, or a faculty member. We have a contract with the donor to use the funds for the purposes that they were donated for. We cannot socialize those funds to do with as we wish. They're not slush funds. They're not funds that are sitting there piling up interest that we aren't using. Also, this is really, really important. MCW receives less than $1 million a year of unrestricted gifts. The majority of our endowment is in restricted gifts. What the federal government is asking us to do is, I believe, not ethical, which is to appropriate the dollars that were given for a certain purpose for other uses. The second point that the government is making is that these wealthy universities shouldn't be charging tuition. Medical schools are in a different category. We subsidize the education of our students, and we have the third largest private medical school in the country. 50% of the actual cost of delivering that education. We're already investing clinical dollars in educating 51% of the practicing physicians in Wisconsin. So I would say that that idea is misguided at best.
Thanks, Dr. Raymond. Johannes, would you like to respond to any sort of the claims that NIH has made around this about, universities having endowments they can use, lower indirect costs for private foundations, and directing more funds towards scientific research?
No, I listened to Dr. John Raymond. I thought, boy, he prepared him very well with that answer, because that is exactly the point on the foundation money, right? When you do fundraising, a donor has specific passion for something. And I remember at UWM, there's a big donor who said, public health, that's where I want to give my money. Another donor said, I really want to give this money for students for scholarships in the classic. So it is very restricted, and you have to oblige to what people really want to give the money for. So I don't think it's just a free for all and give the money out. So I do think looking at when you have a very rich university and just say that's applicable to everybody, it just simply cannot work that way. So there are limitations and there are ethical guidelines in the way that we spend and use that money. I do think the bottom line for me is, again, to quote Dr. Raymond here, is if it is stuck at 15%, we will have no other choice than to shrink research. That is for me the implication, because it's holistic. You really have to look at direct and indirect costs to really understand the research enterprise itself in health. And again, as I said previously, it's expensive research. The infrastructure comes at a cost. If you cut that, you cut research, full stop.
Sean, if I may interject here in terms of indirect costs, another way to look at it is facilities, equipment, and administration costs. That's a term that most people would recognize. But as Dr. Raymond said, American healthcare and research is really the envy of the world right now. There's one word that can change that, and that's China. China, when you look at their trend lines in terms of what they finance for health research, it's entirely government dollars. In America, the trend line's gone something like this with NIH. In China, it's like that. And the increment it has come from private dollars and university dollars as what's kept the research engine in this country running. In China, they could catch us. It could happen because of how they have really put so much money into that. So when the administration talks in other ways about the threats from China to the overall U.S. economy, this position right now on NIH, I think, is inconsistent with their larger considerations and worries.
If I could just add something again to Tom, that what you said, it really makes sense. And one of the things we need to strongly consider is the demoralizing effect of these interventions on young scientists that are going to say, you know what, I'm not going to do this. I'm going to choose to do something else. These are our best and brightest people that have chosen a hard career to begin with, that depends on them obtaining extramural funding to do the work that's their passion. And universities across the board have done what we did and the UW system has done, which is to say, you know what, we can't take many graduate students this year. Graduate students, we pay for them. They cost money. They don't pay tuition. And I don't think people recognize that. You go a couple of years when you don't bring in graduate students, you are going to have negative impacts for generations to come. And this isn't the type of workforce where you can stop it for a few years and start it right back up again. We're going to lose momentum, we're going to lose our edge, and we're going to lose the best and brightest.
So Dr. Raymond, you're kind of going where I was heading towards next, which is the long-term impacts of these decisions. Can you elaborate a little bit more on what will be long-term impacts thus far? And, if these policies continue, I mean, what is this going to mean for research in the state?
I don't want to sound overly dramatic, but the impact will be profound. And we will all need to shrink our research enterprises, even the so-called wealthy Ivy League schools. We also will have an impact on all of our other missions. The education mission will no longer be as enriched as it is by the talent that we bring in to do research and the environment that we create that facilitates outstanding education. Those are going to be imperiled. One of the things we're thinking about doing is investing in research that is more directly relevant to our health system partners, which would be clinical trials and translational research. That's a survival strategy, but it's not good for the country to choke off discovery science. Again, we are leading the world both in translational healthcare science and in the basic discoveries that are underpinned the work that we do to translate those ideas into better treatments and cures, all of that's in jeopardy.
Sean, could I interject and just build on what Dr. Raymond said there for a moment to not only, he discussed the impact on graduate education and medical education, but there are tangible impacts on undergraduate education throughout the state as well. So, we have hundreds of undergraduates, even here at UWM. It's a much smaller research enterprise than Madison or MCW, but we have hundreds of undergraduates who will actually this Friday, 2 days from now, be presenting their research to campus that in all disciplines here. So if we lose research funding, those students aren't going to get those high impact practices, that hands-on experience in the labs. The students get an opportunity to work one-on-one with faculty, with graduate students, and learn important skills, how research is done, how to interpret data, how to critically think about questions, and design experiments and so on. So even if they don't go on into careers in research, those kinds of skills that they accumulate in the lab are going to benefit them in whatever jobs they have after college. There's data also showing that students who participate in research as undergraduates have better success. They get through, they secure their degree, they get through their programs in lesser amounts of time. So it's really going to be, that loss for the undergraduate education is going to be profound as well.
Thanks, Professor. Johannes, could you talk a little bit about the long-term effects of these policies thus far?
I think a little bit philosophically about this as well. Of course, it will have an economic impact, just the sector, right? If you, and for me, when I even prepared for this webcast, I again got the impression the size of our health industry, the $1.5 billion that is generated through the work and the funding of the NIH. So it's big. And if we shrink that, there will be an economic impact. For me, that's a given, right? In all sectors. Secondly, I just think your life, your health, your wellness, the ease of access to drugs that has been created through basic research, long-term, we will pay that price, right? Just think of Alzheimer's, obesity, the stuff that we do research on, antibiotics and drug-resistant infections. These are all NIH funded. And if that gets crippled, eventually it will translate into our own lives and touch us. And then thirdly, I just think about the research reality, being a researcher myself, what's happening at the university. And I cannot just echo enough what Dr. Frick and Dr. Raymond just said, young researchers, doctoral students that don't have that opportunity now to come because they're not funded. That is the next generation of researchers. Now, if you listen to what Dr. Frick said at the beginning, she said over 25 years. Over 25 years. It means for me, basic research takes time, takes money. No entrepreneur in the private sector would initially invest 25 years of money in Dr. Frick and say, I'm going to be a billionaire. That is where the collective good, the understanding of common wealth of all of us come into play. And that is my concern. It's basic research that takes time before it's translated into an enterprise that brings in money. And, in the last 80 years in the US, one of the best selling points is our universities. That's why I came, right? It's really the university system in the world. If you look forward and you want to be negative, you can say, well, how are we going to look 20 years from now? Because we might cripple our basic research, not over 20 years, but in a very short period of time. And it will take a very, very long time to rebuild that. And that is my concern. That's why I try to be positive and say, bring across that message. Don't hamper us short term, but look at the long-term effect and how long it will take to rebuild what we have at this point. So that's kind of my philosophical look at what's playing out.
Thanks. We just had an audience question, which would be, have Johannes or maybe Dr. Raymond, can you maybe both touch on this, but have you seen top talent already leave because of these changes?
Not yet. Remember, they're only 2 months old, not even 2 months. But there is a chilling effect on our students and junior faculty who are questioning whether They want to live with this uncertainty and what they perceive as attacks on their life's work.
Yeah, I would say the same. Sean, I don't know if people directly leaving. I don't know what's in people's minds other than the uncertainty in bringing in students. But I do know a number of students, doctoral students, researchers would be a little bit more cautious before they make a decision, specifically in this space.
Thanks. Tom, can you talk a little bit about what private industry sees as the long-term effects of this? What are you expecting to see as like a ripple from these decisions thus far?
Well, and again, I think the investor core in Wisconsin and beyond looks at this with a lot of caution. You know, when you take a look at just in general where a lot of investments are made in Wisconsin in terms of sector, health related pieces are a big part of that. So that's one. I think you see the indirect sort of economic losses that can come from just the loss of NIH dollars and what it does to institutions in the state in terms of their range, not just the folks who are within those institutions, but folks who maybe are hired to do contractual work with those institutions. So, you know, again, I think one of the biggest things that would be a threat in Wisconsin with its history of innovation and everything from vitamins to genetics to stem cells is the notion of losing that kind of edge. And then what that means for people, especially in a state like ours, where our demographics are a little older than some places, right? And so when you talk about research such as what Dr. Frick is doing with Alzheimer's or with cancer or things like transplantation of organs, all of that can touch on us in some ways that, you know, would not be good overall. But again, I think there's a very, very direct economic impact that would go far beyond any savings that might be realized with NIH cuts.
Thanks, Tom. We're fast kind of running out of time on this issue. And one thing that we heard a lot from audience members who submitted questions was an interest in what you all are kind of doing to address or push against these cuts and advocate for them and what they can also do to in this situation. And Tom, I'm wondering if you could maybe start with that. I mean, what is the Tech Council doing in response to the actions?
Well, we've in terms of our direct advisory role, we're a science and tech advisor to the governor and the legislature here. That's not the main target. However, we're trying to make sure that they understand that there is an effect that could cascade through the rest of the economy here in the state. We're also in touch with members of Congress, and we have tried to make sure that they understand that this can have a direct effect. And Wisconsin's delegation, I think, is, appears to be generally open. We communicate broadly. Obviously, Wisconsin Health News does an excellent job of this, but we communicate broadly with our members and with folks around the state and beyond about what the effects are. For example, I've personally written 3 columns on this already and plan to do more. And so there's that indirect piece. But I think our members, again, are so diverse. And we're kind of ecumenical. It's not just health. It's going to be everything from information technology to advanced manufacturing, but to help them understand that they all have a role in this and could see the effects of this as well. I think that's helped with our individual members being able to reach out.
Thanks, Tom. Johannes, what is UW kind of doing in response to these questions? What advocacy work are you all undertaking?
Yeah, I think, the same as Tom said earlier and what I mentioned earlier, it is really effective communication, and if I just think and I listen again to the panel today and the powerful message of science, it's not a political message, it's a message about our wellness, our well-being, our health. How do we bring that message across to people who have influence, who can make decisions? It's really maybe we should rephrase it, maybe we should rethink, how do we bring that message across to convince people this is really a good investment for the future of the United States, right? That is just that messaging. I think to Tom's point, working with your congressional delegation in Wisconsin, open-minded, listening, reflective, continue. I know President Raffman is working diligently with our congregational delegation from Wisconsin. And then I think, as I mentioned earlier, I do know Madison is reaching out to a powerful alumni base to bring across the message. I think that is a very powerful voice. And then use social media. I know Karyn was the other day with, I don't know who else was on the media platform on cancer and Alzheimer's research that we are doing. So use the platforms to bring across a consistent apolitical message about our health. That's how I see what we can do in the current situation we're in.
Thank you, Johannes. Dr. Raymond, what do you think?
Yeah, you heard some very wise words from both Johannes and Tom. We are working with our congressional delegation. I've been in each one of our U.S. representatives' office, and both senators, they are listening, they're curious, they want to understand the impact on our citizenry. So we're blessed to have a good delegation that cares. Where it gets tricky is getting up on the public soapbox. And I think the message that Johannes said about being positive about the impact and not necessarily criticizing people is important, because there actually is, I think, a legitimate fear of retribution if you speak out in the wrong way that is new. It is not something that we've generally had to deal with in the past. And one thing that is new for MCW is, for the first time ever, we have encouraged our faculty and staff to speak freely and even use their MCW email accounts to connect with their congressional leaders and to amplify our messages on social media. We believe now is the time to understand that there is a certain quality to quantity, and the more voices that are speaking out in favor of science, the harder it's going to be to ignore the messages.
Thanks, Dr. Raymond. Professor Frick, we'll give the last word to you. What can researchers and others do in this situation?
What can we do? Well, I've told my graduate students to just focus on their research. We can just keep going and keep doing the work until somebody tells us not to. And so, we're keeping our heads down and trying to do our research. Of course, also, contacting congressional representatives, making sure that people know how important this is. It's important to really understand that these health issues that we're talking about, Alzheimer's disease, Parkinson's disease, cancer, they don't care what our ideological beliefs are. They don't care what our political beliefs are. They affect everyone. So when we shortchange, when we stop doing research, when we aren't able to bring new drugs, new medical procedures to Americans lose out, because we're going to be less healthy. We're not going to have new treatments for Alzheimer's, new treatments for cancer. And that's a shame, because everybody wants to live a healthy life. And, we, as Dr. Raymond said, we have been the envy of the world for our scientific innovations, and we don't want to lose that, because we're compromising our health if we do.
Thanks, Professor. And thanks again to all of our panelists for talking today. Really appreciate it. Thanks for everyone who attended, and have a great day, everyone.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Thanks, Sean.